Mosaic Technologies had always been the kind of place where middle management confused arrogance with authority, like a peacock convention where everyone forgot they couldn't actually fly. I'd been their senior financial analyst for 3 years, turning their chaotic spreadsheets into something resembling actual business intelligence. The quarterly budget forecast was my specialty, a delicate dance of historical data, market trends, and educated guesswork that somehow kept the lights on and the board satisfied. Our office occupied the 14th floor of a glass tower that reflected the city's ambitions back at itself. The accounting department lived in a corner section where natural light came to die, surrounded by the soft hum of processors and the occasional prayer muttered over stubborn Excel formulas. My desk sat strategically positioned between the coffee machine and the printer, prime real estate for observing office politics in their natural habitat. I'd built my reputation on accuracy. While other analysts threw numbers at walls like spaghetti hoping something would stick, I crafted forecasts with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker and the foresight of someone who actually read industry reports rather than just skimmed their executive summaries. My quarterly presentations had become something of a legend. Board members would nod approvingly, questions would be minimal, and approvals would flow like wine at a company retreat. Then came Jonas Bridgewater, our newly minted VP of Operations, fresh from some consulting firm where they probably taught him that humans were just expensive algorithms waiting to be replaced. He'd arrived 6 weeks ago with a LinkedIn profile that read like a greatest hits album of corporate buzzwords and a handshake that felt like grabbing a dead fish with ambition. Jonas strutted into my cubicle that Tuesday morning like a peacock wearing a discount suit, clutching a tablet that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget and wearing the sort of smile that makes you instinctively check your wallet for missing credit cards. "Danielle," he announced, not bothering with pleasantries or even basic human decency, "we're streamlining operations. The budget forecast is getting automated this quarter. Plus, frankly, you're too expensive for this kind of work." The air in the office seemed to thicken, like humidity before a storm that promises to ruin everyone's weekend plans. I could feel my colleagues' eyes darting between their monitors and our conversation, pretending to focus on emails while their ears practically grew antennae. Melissa from Accounts Payable had stopped pretending to type entirely, her fingers hovering over her keyboard like a pianist about to perform a funeral march. "Automated," I repeated, keeping my voice as level as a carpenter's tool fresh from calibration. "Interesting approach." His smugness radiated like heat from summer asphalt, practically visible in the recycled office air. "It's called efficiency, Danielle. The software handles everything now: data input, trend analysis, projections. No human error, no emotional bias, no complications." He said complications the way someone might say infectious disease, with a mixture of disgust and barely concealed fear. The next few days felt like watching a slow-motion car crash from the passenger seat while the driver insists they've got everything under control and reaches for their phone. Jonas had purchased some budget forecasting software called Predictimax Pro, a name that sounded like it was designed by a marketing team that had never actually seen a spreadsheet but had very strong opinions about what success should sound like. The software promised the moon, delivered about as much actual value as a chocolate teapot, and came with a price tag that could have funded a small country's GDP. During the demonstration, Jonas had gathered the entire finance department into the conference room that smelled perpetually of stale coffee and broken dreams, his presentation slides filled with testimonials from companies I'd never heard of and statistics that seemed to have been generated by the same algorithm that creates fake reviews for kitchen gadgets. "Watch this," he'd said, inputting our last quarter's data with the theatrical flair of a magician about to pull a rabbit from a hat. The software churned for approximately 30 seconds, long enough for Jonas to explain how machine learning algorithms leverage synergistic data points to optimize predictive accuracy, before spitting out a forecast that suggested we'd either triple our revenue or declare bankruptcy, possibly both simultaneously. The room fell silent except for the persistent hum of the ventilation system and what sounded suspiciously like someone trying not to laugh. Thomas from budgeting raised his hand tentatively, like a student asking whether homework was really due tomorrow. "Jonas, these numbers, they seem a bit optimistic?" "That's exactly the kind of limiting mindset we need to eliminate," Jonas responded with the confidence of someone who'd never had to explain a budget variance to an angry board member. "The algorithm sees opportunities we miss because we're trapped in historical thinking patterns." I watched from my newly assigned seat in the back row. Apparently being too expensive also meant being relegated to the cheap seats, as they fed our company data into this digital crystal ball. Historical revenue figures went in one end, and out the other came projections that would make a fortune teller blush and a CFO reach for heavy medication. The software had apparently decided that Mosaic Technologies was either the next Apple or heading for bankruptcy, sometimes both in the same report, occasionally within the same paragraph. It treated our one-time client bonuses as recurring revenue, interpreted seasonal fluctuations as permanent growth trends, and seemed to believe that market volatility was just a suggestion rather than a financial reality. But here's the thing about being sidelined, it gives you perspective. And time. Lots of time to observe, analyze, and quietly document every spectacular miscalculation unfolding before your eyes like a financial train wreck in slow motion. While Jonas basked in his technological triumph, sending emails about revolutionary forecasting methodologies and scheduling meetings to discuss paradigm shifts in predictive analytics, I started noticing things that made my professional soul ache. The software couldn't distinguish between seasonal fluctuations and actual trends. It thought our December holiday bonus spike meant we'd discovered the secret to infinite money generation. It had no understanding of our industry's cyclical nature, treating temporary market upticks like permanent fixtures of reality. Most critically, it had completely missed the upcoming regulatory changes that would impact our Q4 numbers. New compliance requirements were rolling out in October that would require significant infrastructure investments, but Predictimax Pro treated regulations like weather, something that happened to other people. I tried mentioning these concerns to Jonas, approaching him with the diplomatic grace of a UN mediator attempting to negotiate peace between caffeinated squirrels. I prepared careful analyses, documented inconsistencies, and presented alternatives with the sort of professional restraint that usually reserved for dealing with particularly stubborn children. His response was about as receptive as a brick wall with commitment issues and half the intellectual curiosity. "The algorithm knows what it's doing, Danielle," he'd say, waving dismissively while never actually looking at my documentation. "Unlike humans, it doesn't have hunches or feelings. It has data." Right. Data that apparently came with the analytical sophistication of a magic 8-ball and twice the confidence of a fortune cookie written by someone who'd never balanced a checkbook. Jonas had started holding daily algorithm optimization meetings where he'd explain how Predictimax Pro was learning our business patterns and adapting to our unique organizational dynamics. These sessions felt like attending a religious service for a deity made of spreadsheets and wishful thinking, complete with Jonas as head priest preaching the gospel of automated intelligence to a congregation of increasingly concerned finance professionals. "Traditional forecasting is fundamentally flawed," he'd pontificate, gesturing at charts that looked like they'd been designed by someone having a particularly vivid fever dream. "Human analysts bring emotional baggage, historical bias, and limited processing capacity. Predictimax Pro transcends these limitations." Meanwhile, the software continued producing forecasts that suggested we invest heavily in underwater basket weaving while divesting from our core technology services. It recommended expanding into markets that didn't exist and cutting costs in departments that generated 90% of our revenue. Watching Jonas defend these recommendations was like watching someone explain why water flows uphill, technically impressive in its creativity, practically concerning for everyone involved. The board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday, circled on everyone's calendar like a deadline for the apocalypse. I knew this because I'd helped prepare these presentations for years, back when my insights were considered valuable rather than expensive, when accuracy mattered more than automation, and when forecasting was treated as a professional skill rather than something you could download from the internet. Jonas had been strutting around the office like a rooster who'd learned to use PowerPoint, sending emails about his revolutionary approach to financial forecasting and scheduling preparatory meetings to discuss his preparatory meetings. He'd ordered new suits for the presentation, upgraded his laptop, and somehow acquired a pointer that looked like it belonged in a NASA mission briefing. The man was preparing for his coronation as the genius who'd solved business forecasting forever. I made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying, like stepping off a cliff while being completely certain you could fly. If they wanted automation, they'd get automation, just not the kind Jonas was expecting, and definitely not the kind that would survive contact with board members who'd been evaluating financial projections since before Excel was a twinkle in Bill Gates' eye. I spent my weekend crafting a parallel analysis that would have made my old statistics professor weep with pride. Not to sabotage the automated system, that was accomplishing quite spectacularly on its own, but to provide what I knew the board would actually want: context, nuance, and realistic projections based on market realities rather than algorithmic fantasies generated by software that seemed to think businesses operated like video games. I prepared 2 versions of every chart, every projection, every recommendation. One showing what Jonas's wonder software predicted, a financial wonderland where growth curves looked like ski jumps and profit margins defied gravity, and another showing what the numbers actually meant when filtered through industry knowledge, regulatory awareness, and common sense. My alternative analysis told a different story. It acknowledged the upcoming regulatory changes, accounted for seasonal variations, and factored in market conditions that existed in reality rather than in Predictimax Pro's optimistic imagination. It showed steady, sustainable growth rather than explosive expansion, realistic profit margins rather than fantasy numbers, and strategic recommendations based on our actual capabilities rather than algorithmic wishful thinking. Then I did something that felt both professional and deliciously rebellious. I prepared a comprehensive comparison document that laid out both forecasts side by side, highlighting discrepancies with footnotes explaining the reasoning behind each variance. I sent this analysis directly to the board members, with a note explaining that I'd prepared alternative perspectives for comparison purposes and would be available for any questions they might have about methodology, assumptions, or the fundamental differences between human judgment and artificial enthusiasm. The email went out Sunday evening, timed perfectly to arrive in their inboxes Monday morning, early enough for thorough review, late enough to avoid seeming desperate. Professional, helpful, and devastating in its understated implications. Monday morning arrived with the energy of opening night for a play nobody wanted to perform. Jonas bounced around the office with the manic enthusiasm of someone who'd either discovered caffeine or convinced himself that competence was a substitute for competence. He'd scheduled 3 more preparatory meetings, ordered catered lunch for the presentation day, and somehow acquired a PowerPoint remote that looked like it belonged in a sci-fi movie. Tuesday brought the first cracks in his armor. Board members started calling with clarification questions, the kind that sound innocent but carry the weight of professional skepticism. Why did the forecast assume continuous growth in a cyclical market? How did the algorithm account for regulatory changes? Could someone explain the methodology behind the revenue projections? Jonas handled these inquiries with the grace of someone trying to explain quantum physics using interpretive dance. He'd invoke proprietary algorithms and machine learning optimization while frantically searching through Predictimax Pro's help documentation for answers that didn't exist. By Wednesday, the questions had evolved into concerns, and the concerns were multiplying like rumors in a high school hallway. Board member Eleanor Hutchins, a woman who'd been evaluating financial projections since before computers had colors, called directly requesting additional documentation regarding forecasting methodology and assumption validation. Wednesday evening, Jonas stayed late trying to coax explanations from software that had been designed to provide answers, not justify them. I could see him through the glass walls of his office, gesturing at his monitor like someone arguing with a particularly stubborn GPS system that insisted on directions to nowhere. Thursday arrived with all the drama of a season finale written by someone with a grudge against happy endings. I wasn't in the boardroom. My invitation had apparently been lost in Jonas's ego somewhere between his revolutionary methodology presentation and his paradigm shift in predictive analytics speech, but I didn't need to be. The panicked text messages started around 10:30 a.m., escalating like an anxiety thermometer reading the temperature of professional disaster. Board is asking for revenue source breakdowns. Software doesn't have them. Where are you? Then, they want to know about regulatory impact. Predictimax doesn't calculate compliance costs. Need your input ASAP. Followed by, Hutchins is questioning growth assumptions. Says numbers don't match market conditions. Please advise. Finally, urgent, board questioning all our numbers. They have your analysis. Please call immediately. That last message arrived like a plot twist everyone saw coming except the person writing the story. The beautiful thing about institutional memory is that board members remember when forecasts actually made sense, when presentations answered questions instead of generating them, and when financial projections resembled reality rather than expensive hallucinations. They'd been receiving my reports for 3 years, presentations that anticipated their questions and addressed their concerns before they needed to ask. Suddenly being presented with projections that resembled a fever dream generated by a caffeinated calculator had raised some very pointed questions about methodology, accuracy, and whether anyone had actually looked at these numbers before putting them in front of people whose job was evaluating business viability. By noon, Jonas was practically sprinting through the office like a marathon runner who'd just realized he'd been going the wrong direction for the past 26 miles. His earlier confidence had evaporated like morning dew under a blowtorch, replaced by the kind of panic usually reserved for people who've just discovered their parachute is actually a backpack full of napkins and good intentions. Danielle. He burst into my workspace with all the dignity of a wet cat discovering it wasn't actually waterproof. The board, they're asking questions. Lots of questions. About the numbers, about methodology, about everything. They have your analysis. I looked up from my computer with the sort of calm that comes from knowing exactly how deep the water is before you jump in, the kind of serenity that develops when you've been proven right in the most spectacular way possible. Questions are good, Jonas. They show engagement. Critical thinking. Professional responsibility. His face had taken on the color of old porridge mixed with existential dread. They want explanations we can't provide. The software doesn't, it doesn't explain its reasoning. It just produces numbers. Ah, I said, nodding thoughtfully while internally savoring the irony like fine wine. That does sound like a problem. Almost like you'd need someone with institutional knowledge and analytical experience to interpret the data contextually. They're asking about regulatory impacts, seasonal adjustments, market conditions. His voice trailed off like someone reading their own professional obituary. Predictimax doesn't account for any of that. It just processes historical data and extrapolates trends. Fascinating, I replied, maintaining professional composure while enjoying the poetic justice of watching artificial intelligence meet natural consequences. The emergency meeting that afternoon felt like a masterclass in corporate humility served with a side of professional vindication. The boardroom, usually reserved for quarterly reports and strategic planning sessions, had transformed into something resembling a financial tribunal where algorithms were on trial and human judgment was presenting the prosecution's case. Jonas sat at the conference table looking like he'd been asked to solve calculus using interpretive dance while explaining why his answers didn't match anyone else's math. Board members sat with copies of both forecasts, his algorithmic optimism and my grounded analysis, comparing numbers that told completely different stories about the same company. Eleanor Hutchins led the questioning with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of someone who'd seen every variety of corporate overconfidence in her 30-year career. Jonas, your projection shows 40% revenue growth in Q4, but Ms. Foster's analysis suggests 12%. Can you explain this discrepancy? Jonas launched into an explanation that involved algorithmic optimization, machine learning paradigms, and predictive modeling excellence. It was like listening to someone explain why their horoscope was more accurate than meteorology, technically impressive in its creativity, practically concerning for everyone involved in weather-dependent activities. Meanwhile, I walked the board through actual financial analysis, the kind that acknowledges market realities, accounts for regulatory changes, and doesn't treat business forecasting like a slot machine with delusions of grandeur and an MBA. I explained seasonal variations, regulatory compliance costs, market saturation factors, and competitive landscape changes that would impact our growth trajectory. The algorithm doesn't understand context, I explained, pulling up comparative charts that showed historical patterns Predictimax had missed. It sees last December's holiday bonus surge and assumes we've discovered a permanent revenue stream. It doesn't know that our biggest client is restructuring, that new compliance requirements will require infrastructure investment, or that market conditions have shifted since the data it's analyzing was collected. Board member Robert Chen leaned forward with the expression of someone who'd just watched a magic trick explained. So the software is making projections based on incomplete information? Not incomplete, I clarified, feeling like a translator explaining why Google Translate can't capture poetry. Just uncontextualized. It has access to numerical data but lacks institutional knowledge, industry insight, and strategic understanding. It knows what happened but not why, which makes predicting what will happen next essentially educated guessing with expensive software. The room fell quiet except for the soft rustling of papers and what sounded like Jonas's career prospects deflating in real time. Eleanor Hutchins exchanged glances with the other board members, one of those silent communications that happen when experienced professionals recognize obvious conclusions. Ms. Foster, she said finally, your analysis addresses every concern we've raised today. It's thorough, realistic, and based on factors we can verify and understand. We'd like you to present the official forecast. It took about 20 minutes to restore confidence in our numbers and about 20 seconds to restore my budget forecasting responsibilities, along with what Eleanor diplomatically called expanded analytical oversight. Jonas's automation dream was quietly retired to whatever digital graveyard houses failed efficiency initiatives, joining the ranks of other revolutionary solutions that had revolutionized their way into obsolescence. The best part? I didn't gloat. Didn't need to rub salt in wounds that were already self-inflicted. There's something deeply satisfying about being right without having to point out everyone else's wrongness, like winning an argument by simply standing still while your opponent argues themselves into a corner. Jonas learned that some jobs require more than software solutions, and I learned that sometimes being too expensive just means you're worth exactly what you cost, and sometimes considerably more. 3 weeks later, the official announcement came through company email with the kind of corporate language that makes everything sound like a planned strategic initiative rather than damage control. Jonas was pursuing new opportunities in consulting optimization, translation, fired, while I was promoted to Senior Director of Financial Analytics with expanded responsibilities, a corner office, and what HR diplomatically called comprehensive compensation adjustment. The new VP of Operations, Helena Morrison, recruited from a firm that actually understood the difference between efficiency and effectiveness, scheduled her first meeting with me to discuss integrating human insight with technological tools. Novel concept, apparently. My role expanded beyond forecasting to include strategic planning, risk assessment, and training junior analysts on the fine art of reading between numerical lines. My respect increased, my salary received what Helena called market correction for demonstrated value, and my office gained a window with actual natural light, luxury beyond measure in corporate real estate. Predictimax Pro was quietly removed from our systems, its expensive algorithms replaced by spreadsheets managed by people who understood that numbers tell stories, but only if you know how to listen. The software company sent several follow-up emails asking about our user experience and whether we'd recommend their product to others. I drafted responses that would have been masterpieces of professional sarcasm but ultimately just marked them as spam. These days, when someone suggests automating away human expertise, I just smile and nod politely, like someone listening to a child explain why vegetables are unnecessary if you take vitamins. Experience has taught me that some lessons are best learned firsthand, some shovels are best left unused, and some graves have a way of filling themselves when you're patient enough to watch. The finance department now runs like a well-oiled machine where humans and technology work together rather than against each other. We use software for data processing and computation, but rely on human judgment for interpretation, context, and strategic insight. Revolutionary concept, apparently. Sometimes the most expensive solution is the one that looks cheapest on paper, and sometimes the most valuable employee is the one someone else considers too expensive to keep. Jonas learned this lesson the hard way, but at least he learned it thoroughly. His LinkedIn profile now lists him as an independent consultant specializing in digital transformation strategies, which sounds much better than guy who got fired for trusting software more than staff. I keep his business card in my desk drawer as a reminder that competence without competence is just arrogance with better marketing, and that algorithms are only as smart as the people who program them, and sometimes considerably less wise than the people they're supposed to replace. The best revenge, it turns out, is professional competence served at exactly the right temperature.